I find that when I'm reading the news or when I'm looking at social media, that I find a lot of references to self-care, a lot of references to self-compassion. And sometimes within those stories, there's some really good advice. And then sometimes we get these little bombs thrown at us. Like, you know, you can't love others if you can't love yourself. You can't be kind to others if you don't know how to be kind to yourself. This kind of thing, which is just patently untrue. Of course you can. But when we read these things, when we hear these things, we're asked to turn this lens on ourselves and ask this question: am I being nice enough to me? And if not, what can I do about that? I wanted to talk a little bit about that tonight because I think it's confusing. For me, sometimes it's been confusing. We have this idea, I think, within the tradition and within most spiritual traditions, that to live a selfless life, to live a life of true spiritual practice, is also an act of negating the self. You don't make decisions based on you. You make decisions based on others. We probably, even if we aren't trying to be that way, we have some experience in our lives that feels that way. I think about when our kids were babies and how much care we put into taking care of them and how little care we put into ourselves. We were so tired. We didn't really think in terms of what do I need. And it felt good in a way, and it also felt like we were running on fumes all the time. If you've taken care of kids, if you've taken care of someone who's elderly, if you've been in that position, you know how that feels. And there is something rewarding about it. And in some ways, we can be rewarded by the righteousness of it, of noticing how we're giving and giving, and we're not taking anything for ourselves. And so we have that pressure, that feeling that we should be saints. And then we have this other cultural voice, this one that I'm talking about, that says, hey, what about you? That says, what about your spa day? It's related to the voice that says we should never be uncomfortable, that we should never have symptoms of anything of any kind. We should never be hungry. We should never be tired. Everything should feel good, and when it doesn't, that's a problem. Somehow we have to navigate these things. As with so many things, it can come down to a kind of middle way. But the middle way is hard. The Buddha knew that. When the Buddha proposed the middle way, he wasn't saying, hey guys, I found the solution and it's easy. He was saying, oh guys, I have some rough news. Because it's easier to go to one extreme or the other. When you look at spiritual leaders, when you look at religious teachers, you find there probably aren't as many saints as you would hope. It isn't for lack of trying. People are bad at being saints. And what I mean by that is that either they fall into this self-negation and they burn out because they do forget to sleep and they do forget to eat and they do forget what they're supposed to do. Or They go to the other side. They notice the difficulty of that job. They notice the weight of the job, and they say, you know what? I need something. And because they're in a position of power, sometimes they decide to take everything. But for many, it starts on that same place, at that same starting line of aiming towards sainthood. Saying, I'm going to get this right. And failing. It's easy in some ways to make fun of or to poke at a little bit the message that we're supposed to pamper ourselves, right? Because it can come kind of clothed in decadence. But that's not what I want to say. Not at all. There are things that we can do not just to make ourselves feel better, but to make ourselves better for the world. There's research that shows that when you exercise, for example, that for hours afterwards, you have reduced hostility. It feels good to have less hostility, but it also feels good for everyone else for you to have less hostility. After you exercise, your brain works better. So whatever work you're doing in the world, you can do it better. There's similar research tied to nutrition. We understand that if we take care of this, it enables us to take care of others. And when we don't do that, I think that in many cases, it's not because we're so selfless. It's because we hold ourselves in kind of low regard. Again, we know what it feels like to love someone. We know what it feels like to take care of someone. Going back to when my kids were babies, I used to know everything that they'd eaten in the last 48 hours. And we would make their little baby foods. And I knew that I was supposed to balance the orange foods with the green foods. So much energy went into making sure that their nourishment was perfect, that it was the best it could possibly be. And while I was doing that, I would just reach for whatever was there and I would eat that myself. Again, not because I was a saint, but because I didn't know how to do both. And so I chose one. This message about self-care, this message about self-compassion, within it is a recognition that we ignore ourselves. We care about this thing that is the self, because of course we do. But we don't really care that much about its care and feeding. It's tiring to take care of a person. It's tiring to take care of this person. And it can feel like either or. I'm taking care of this or I'm taking care of that. And so I want to offer just such a simple idea. Simple, but I think about it all the time. And I've mentioned this before, and I'll mention it again, which is that we never have to distinguish between compassion and self-compassion. We don't have to distinguish between care and self-care. And I want to be very clear. There are messages, and you hear them sometimes within Buddhism, that say, for example, that whenever you do something kind for someone else, you're really you should appreciate that you're really reaping those benefits yourself, right? If you put out something good, this good karma comes back. And so you can do that understanding that there's a payment in kind by the universe. I'm not saying that. I don't know if that's true or untrue, but when we talk like that, we're talking about people over there and me over here. We're saying these two things are separate, and that's not what I'm trying to say. What I want to say is that if we take up this path as bodhisattvas, if we take up this path from a place of vow, if we take up this path from the understanding that you and I are not separate, that we and they are not separate, truly not separate, then we can start to look at our own behavior and the choices that we make, not in terms of me serving me or me serving them, but me moving and living and breathing and eating as everyone, as all beings. So that when I choose what to eat, I'm asking myself, what do I want to feed all beings? What do I want to digest as all beings, with all beings, for all beings? What do all beings need? I guarantee you, when you ask this question, it will change some of what you choose. Now, you might sometimes just get that ice cream cone and you'll say, this is for all beings. All beings need an ice cream cone today. That's okay. But there are also things you will put down and there are things you will pick up. There's this danger when we sit in Zazen of imagining I'm sitting for all beings as if I'm giving this gift. But just an inch away from that is another way to sit, in which we sit as all beings. We sit with all beings and we notice this posture is this expression, it's my expression of everything. What expression do I want that to be? When you ask that question, you sit a little bit differently. When you inhale as all beings, when you exhale as all beings, it's different. When in that critical conversation, you have to say just the right thing. We never say just the right thing. But we measure our words differently if we imagine that we are the voice piece of all. And that everyone is listening. When we take up this practice in this way, not as something to give, not something to protect myself from, but with the clear idea that this I, is an expression of much more than this, of much more than me. It cuts through the idea of self-care, because now everything I do is what I would do if I really cared deeply. And compassion becomes true compassion. Not self-compassion is a confusing word because compassion is to be with the suffering of others. You can take out the self and yet still be so kind to you. Not because you're taking that day off, not because you're choosing to create a wall that makes you safe, but because you're not. Because you're dropping that project altogether. Like I said, this is a small idea, but it's one I come back to over and over and over again. For 20 years, I've literally chewed on this question. Forgetting over and over this very simple idea of what it is to make my life an offering. Not in some grand way, not in some saintly way, but with this bite and with this breath, with this step. And so I offer this to you, this experiment. Try it. Try it right now, try it tomorrow. In this moment, if I am doing this with all beings, as all beings, for all beings, what do I do differently? And then do that. And that's Rost.